It's been just over a week now since the death of Bevan Spencer von Einem, who died in the Adelaide Yatala Prison Hospital, aged 79. It's hard to get my head wrapped around it, actually. It's hard to believe that von Einem is dead. You know, he was like the boogeyman. He just this evil presence that lurked all over Adelaide for so long. Even though he's been locked up for over 4 decades, he still just had this presence. In every time I looked at certain parts of the city, I would think of von Einem, and well, now he's gone. He's dead, and well, he's just a man like you and I, flesh and blood. So, but nonetheless, the von Einem story is something that has fascinated me and repulsed me for so many years now. That's how really this YouTube channel of mine began. I was too young to remember the actual murders. I was only 5 years old in 1983 when Richard Kelvin was murdered. But I certainly remember from the mid-late 80s onwards, particularly in that period, to the early 90s, von Einem was ubiquitous. Always on TV, always in the media, some new developments or what have you, and I remember my mum and my older brother talking about him, and they would bring up the subject of how these poor young men had died at the hands of von Einem, and it sounded so grotesque and so evil that I don't think I comprehended it as hearing these things I probably shouldn't have heard. But he was just always on people's minds. And a bit later on, in the 1990s, I became fascinated about the psychology of serial killers, and eventually found my way back to von Einem, and I dug deeper into his crimes, and again, they were just so brutal, so sadistic, and they happened right here in Adelaide, my home city. So that just made it so compelling and fascinating, and it just took off from there. And that's how this YouTube channel came about. In 2018, I made a quick video, which is still up here, of me retracing the steps Richard Kelvin had taken on the night of his abduction. Back then that was October 2018 when I made that video. I didn't have as much information at my fingertips as I would later have, and I updated the video later on. But when I made that video, I don't know how many subscribers I had, probably a handful, if that many, I can't even remember. And I decided to see, I had no idea if anyone would be interested in that video, in the von Einem murders. But people were interested, and the feedback I received was very encouraging and very positive, and that spurred me on to make more videos on Bevan Spencer von Einem. So that's where we're at now. So in this video, I'm just going to show you by Google Maps or Google Earth all the locations of von Einem's murders and associated happenings. I've already made videos on the locations of the murders, where I actually visit the location, so I don't need to do that. But this, I just want to make this a concise, relatively short video. Probably won't be that short, but just showing you via Google Maps where everything happened here in Adelaide, South Australia. So we'll begin with a short biographical sketch on Bevan Spencer von Einem. He was born on May the 29th, 1946, at the Hindmarsh Memorial Hospital in Hindmarsh. Very close to the city, in fact. I suppose you'd call that maybe an inner western suburb. His parents were Bernhardt and Thora. He had 3 siblings, older siblings. Von Einem was the youngest. He had 2 brothers, Lyle and Desmond, and a sister, Carleen. I do remember reading somewhere a while back that one of his brothers had passed away. They'd be well into their 80s, all of them now. As for the other 2 siblings, I don't know. So I'll just show you where the Hindmarsh Hospital, it's no longer there. It's probably long gone. I know nothing about it, its history or anything of that nature. but I believe there was a hospital here on Holden Street in Hindmarsh, inner western suburb of Adelaide. So this is Holden Street. Now I have no idea where this hospital was, but I believe it was on here. That's where von Einem was born in 1946. That's Cooper Stadium there, the soccer ground. So just pull back and show you how close to the city we are. Well, closer than I'm from. That's the city of Adelaide here, Central Business District. So yeah, so that's where the hospital was. Now, von Einem grew up at number 8 Anderson Street in Theberton. So we'll go there now. That's very close by to where he was born. Just pan a bit further south. So there it is. It's popped up. Yeah, so in this place here, Anderson Street in Theberton. Again, very close to the city. Now, as you can see here, Anderson Street perhaps ran all the way here. This is Port Road here to the right of screen. Now, this has clearly changed a lot over the years. This used to be the West End Brewery grounds. It was until very recently. Unfortunately, it's gone now. It was a landmark of Adelaide, especially if you're a footy supporter, because of the big chimney, which had the premiership winning colours up. And I remember in 2012-14 as a Nord supporter, we won a hat-trick of premierships and visiting the brewery location. And that was a great memory, but it's all gone now, so this is all empty. I'm sure they're going to build, I don't know what they're going to build, houses, I think. But yeah, so I went down here on Thursday to have a look. There was nothing to see. But this area, it curves around from, what street was that? Cawthorne Street here to there. So this probably was old Anderson Street, but I think it's part of the brewery now, so it's inaccessible to the public. So all this street was where von Einem lived, and that was the house there. So I did read he lived behind the brewery. So, but it's all an industrial area now, and I couldn't see any residential housing in this area. It's just factories and what have you. But yeah, that's where von Einem was raised. Again, right next to the city. City is just over here. If we have a look here, a bit closer. Where's Port Road? Port Road runs along here. That's the entertainment centre there, so that's where von Einem lived. Now, in 1965, von Einem began working at the Pipeline Supplies of Australia, which we'll go to now when this thing starts working for me. So we'll go a bit further north. Now this used to be at 545 South Road, Regency Park. Just in here. That's where von Einem worked. Now he worked there his whole adult life. Again, working there in 1965, he would have been 18 years old, I assume, at the start of the year. And I assume he started working there after school, graduating perhaps in 1964. Don't hold me to that, but I'm assuming. And yeah, got the job as a bookkeeper / accountant. Not sure if he was an accountant or not. Some say he was, some say he wasn't. But he was certainly a bookkeeper. He worked there his whole adult life, which turned out to be just 18 years, because obviously in 1983 he was arrested for murder and spent the rest of his days in prison. But yeah, that's where he worked, on South Road at Regency Park. So that was the early years of Bevan Spencer von Einem. In 1978, after a period of moving from several houses, von Einem and his mother Thora moved into number 13 Rowney Avenue in Campbelltown, unit number 3. Campbelltown in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide. So in this area here. Yeah, so that's the unit block there where von Einem and his mother lived from 1978 until April 1983. So von Einem was living here when 4 of the murders were committed, and that's where we'll begin with the murders. The first murder, of course, was of 17-year-old Alan Barnes, who was abducted on Sunday afternoon, June the 17th, 1979. Now that weekend, Alan had spent it with a friend of his named Darko Castellan here at 677 Torrens Road in Cheltenham, in the western suburbs of Adelaide, so this area here. On that Sunday afternoon, Alan and Darko, I believe from Darko's brother, were driven a short distance to Grand Junction Road, intersection of Anderson Road and Grand Junction Road. So this is Anderson Road here, Grand Junction Road here. That's where Alan Barnes and Darko were dropped off, and the two began hitchhiking. Alan was trying to get home to his place in Salisbury in the northern suburbs. So they walked along here. They began walking in an easterly direction, trying to hitchhike. They weren't having any luck, so at some point Darko left and left Alan by himself to hitchhike, and so Alan continued walking in an easterly direction. Now he'd walked a fair distance. As you can see here, this is where we believe Alan Barnes was picked up and abducted, in this area here on Grand Junction Road. So this is that's Production Road there. That's Grand Junction Road here. This is the Mansfield Park Hotel is over here. So witness believed they saw Alan getting into the car in this general area here, which is on the, well, this is Mansfield Park this side, the northern side is Wingfield. So we'll assume that's where Alan Barnes was picked up and abducted, and he was never seen again. 1 week later, on Sunday afternoon, June the 24th, 1979, Alan's body was found at the South Para Reservoir in the Adelaide Hills, northeast of the city, right on the border of Kersbrook and Williamstown. So he was found in here. Alan's body had been dumped off the bridge here, South Para Road. I'm sure they were intending to drop Alan into the water, into the reservoir, but the reservoir was dry, and underneath the new bridge, this is the new bridge, there's an old bridge and road, some 20 or so meters underneath, and Alan's body hit this area here. It appears he was dumped on the Friday night, early Saturday morning of, what would that be, June the 22nd, 23rd, and his body was found on the Sunday afternoon, the 24th, by a man and a woman who were walking in the grounds. They'd parked their motorbike, I would say, up here on South Para Road. In those days, you could actually gain access to the reservoir grounds from this area easily. There were no fences and stuff. As of today, well, I was last there in 2021, it's all fenced off now, so I had to go the long way in to get into the grounds, but in those days I'm sure they just would have walked in. So Alan's body was found there. The autopsy revealed that Alan had been actually kept alive for 5 days after his abduction, so he was most likely murdered on the Friday night, the 22nd. He died from blood loss from an injury to his anus after a blunt object had been inserted forcefully. Now, Alan was actually 16 years old at the time of his abduction, but tragically, he actually turned 17 while being held captive. His birthday was Thursday, June the 21st, the day before he would have been murdered. So that just adds a tragic dimension. So if you ever see a discrepancy with the age, he was 16 when he was abducted, but actually 17 when he was murdered. So that was the murder of Alan Barnes. 2 months after Alan Barnes was murdered, von Einem struck again. This time his victim was 25-year-old Neil Muir, who was abducted on Monday, August the 27th, 1979. So we'll go back into the city of Adelaide. At the time of his murder, Neil was living at 156 Carrington Street in the city. So this is it right here, Carrington Street. I believe it was a boarding house, or unfortunately Neil had been addicted to heroin. I believe at the time he was undergoing methadone treatment. So life had been pretty rough for Neil at this point. Now, on the night he was last seen, we'll cruise to the old Mediterranean Hotel in Adelaide, which is a relatively short distance from where Neil lived. So this is number 111. This building's in the way here. Why are you doing that? 111 Hindley Street in the heart of Adelaide. Used to be the Mediterranean Hotel, so this building here, that's Hindley Street up here. Neil was last seen leaving the Mediterranean Hotel that night, I believe, and began walking in a westerly direction, which is this way, to the left of screen. And that was the last time he was ever seen. At some point, he obviously was abducted and murdered. Now, Neil's body was found the next day, Tuesday, August the 28th, 1979. And we'll go out to Osborne, in the western suburbs of Adelaide. So this area right here is where Neil Muir was found. His remains, which had been dismembered and mutilated, had been thrown off a wharf. So this area here, off Veitch Road in Osborne, west of the city. So this is Veitch Road here. Just pull back a bit here. So the entrance to Veitch Road is here. I would have driven along here and to the old wharf here. And Neil's remains were they were placed in garbage bags and thrown off the end of the wharf here. The intention undoubtedly was to throw them into water, but like Alan Barnes, it didn't succeed. Instead, the garbage bag jagged in the rocks at low tide, and his remains were found by a man going fishing, and he saw the garbage bag. Now, Neil had been murdered quickly, but then had been extensively dismembered and mutilated in a horrific fashion. He had died from the same anal injury, blood loss, as Alan Barnes, but the mutilation and dismemberment was very different. And his body was placed into garbage bags and thrown into the Port River. So this is the Port River right here. So that was the murder of Neil Muir. After the murder of Neil Muir, there was a 2-year break. And ironically, von Einem's third victim was abducted exactly 2 years after Neil Muir was abducted, which I'm sure was just coincidence, but his third victim was 14-year-old Peter Stogneff, who was abducted on Thursday, August the 27th, 1981. So now Peter at the time was living in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide. Whoops, I've gone to the wrong location, excuse for that. I'm going to Peter's home where he lived. So yeah, Peter at the time was living at 11 Deakin Avenue in Hope Valley, which is in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide. So this is Peter's former home here, where he was living at the time of his abduction. Now on that Thursday morning, Peter set off for school. He would have left the home here, walked out into Deakin Avenue here. He was carrying his school bag, I believe he's in his school uniform. I believe he went to Modbury High School, which is nearby, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But Peter had no intention of going to school. He was wagging school that day. Where he went after he left his home, we're not too sure about. Nearby is the Tea Tree Plaza shopping centre. So this area here is the Tea Tree Plaza shopping centre. It's a relatively short walk from where Peter lived. Just pull back a bit and show you how close it is to where he's home. It's a bit of a walk, but not too far. We don't know exactly where Peter went after he left home, but he may have went to the Tea Tree Plaza shopping centre. But at some point he returned back to Deakin Avenue because he left his school bag in the garage. His dad later saw the bag in the shed, so Peter obviously returned back to Deakin Avenue before once again setting off. And where he went, we don't know. And where he was abducted, we don't know. But Peter certainly was abducted and subsequently murdered. Now his body and his remains were not found until Tuesday, June the 22nd, 1982, nearly 10 months later. So we'll go out to where Peter Stogneff's remains were found. He was found off Middle Beach Road, north of the city. When we've been able to deduce that he was most likely found on Smith Road, not Middle Beach Road. So this is in Two Wells, by the way. So this is Middle Beach Road here. This is this continuation here that leads out to, well, the beach obviously. So that's the beach out there. But through investigating Peter's murder, it's most likely he was actually found on what is Smith Road here. Now he was found by a farmer, and there's a farmhouse right in here, which may have been the location it was in 1981. Now it's quite a convoluted process. The farmer, on May the 20th, 1982, so a month before, had set fire to a whole bunch of debris that he had compiled on the side of the road. He'd put it there during the summer, and then when the weather turned colder, when it was dry, he set fire to it and let it burn. Now he returned to the fire remains on, as I said, June the 22nd, 1982. This is a general location. I'm not exactly sure where Peter's remains were found, so we're just estimating on here somewhere. He checked the remains of the fire, and that's when he discovered Peter's skeleton. That's all that remained of Peter was his skeleton, and he reported it to the police the next day, June 23rd, 1982. As I said, all that remained of Peter was his skeleton, but interestingly the skeleton had been dismembered into 3 pieces, somewhat similar to Neil Muir. But that's all we know about whatever happened to Peter Stogneff, as there was no way to determine what other injuries he had endured, though it's more than likely he suffered the same anal injuries as all the other victims did. So that was the murder of Peter Stogneff. Von Einem's fourth victim was 18-year-old Mark Langley, who was abducted in the early morning hours of Sunday, February the 28th, 1982. So we'll begin at Mark's home, which is in here. This is number 28 Devon Avenue, Newton, in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide. So this was Mark Langley's home. Now on Saturday night, February the 27th, 1982, Mark attended a birthday party at nearby Windsor Gardens. So we'll just travel a short distance to Windsor Gardens. So this is again in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide, where I believe it was a birthday party was held. Now circa midnight, Mark, along with two of his friends, Mark was a passenger. Mark actually drove at the time, but he'd been involved in a car accident, I think in the week before his abduction. I don't think he was injured, but his car was put out of action, so he wasn't driving that night, which is ironic. If he had been driving, what happened may not have happened, but nonetheless, Mark was a passenger with two friends. Now they drove into the city, which is not that far away. So Windsor Gardens is up here, and the city is in here. So they left the party at about midnight. Mark's parents and two younger sisters were at the party. Tragically, that would be the last time they would see him. Now, after being in the city for some time, Mark and his two companions drove and ended up here on War Memorial Drive at about 1:30 a.m, which is now Sunday morning, February the 28th, 1982. So that's on the northern banks of the River Torrens. So we'll just pull back to give you some location context. So that's where they parked here. That's the city here to the south, Adelaide Oval over here. Just go back to that. The University Oval in front of them. So they parked the car here, but at some point a disagreement of some description occurred between Mark and his friends. Mark wasn't happy. He was angry. He got out of the car and he walked off into the night. And he walked in a easterly direction around here. The question is, where exactly did he walk to? There are several ways he could have gone. This is the University footbridge here, which connects the northern and southern sides of the Torrens. So he could have, just go back here to War Memorial Drive. So that's War Memorial Drive here. And if you walk along there, there's a path that leads to the University footbridge. Side note, Dr. Duncan was thrown into the Torrens in 1972 around this area here. But Mark could have walked across the footbridge and emerged onto the southern side of the Torrens, or he could have walked along either the banks of the Torrens or along the road here. And if he'd followed this path here, he could have ended up over here to the east. Now I'll just go back here a bit. Mark's two companions, after Mark got out of the car, they drove around. They did a loop of the area, so they would have driven along War Memorial Drive up here to the where the zoo is, onto the bridge. Sorry, just show that again. Up to the bridge here, and they would have, and then onto Frome Road, which would have led them onto Victoria Drive. Victoria Drive comes out here to King William Road, the King William Road Bridge, and that would have led them back onto, that's Edwin Smith Drive, and back to War Memorial Drive. So they did a 360 loop looking for Mark, but they couldn't see him. So that leads me to believe that Mark wasn't walking along the road, but probably on the banks of the Torrens. Now we'll go to where he possibly was abducted, just east of his location, to this area here, which is Hackney Road. Now we don't know for sure Mark was picked up by Von Einem here, but a witness did later say that he saw someone matching Mark's description getting into a car. They could have been Mark Langley, perhaps it wasn't, but it does make sense. So I'll just pull back and give you a shot here. So that's where Mark Langley got out of the car, and this is Hackney Road here. And all through this area that's the banks of the Torrens. You can walk along there. It's a beautiful area. Lots of trees to cover. At night it would have been lack of visibility around there. I mean, there's some lights along the Torrens, but yeah. So it appears that Mark was most likely picked up by Von Einem on Hackney Road. Now, Von Einem later he didn't testify, but he actually admitted to police that on that Saturday night, so early Sunday morning, he was in the city cruising around. Of course, he claims all innocently, but he was definitely on the prowl. And Von Einem, of course, did live in the northeastern suburbs, which is over this way here, and he would have probably come around this area. Now Mark would have been trying to get back to Newton, where he lived. Obviously he'd now found himself without a car, so let's see if we can work this out. So that's where, let's say Mark was either hitchhiking or walking along here. His home is up here in Newton, so you can see the distance there. It's a fair distance. At that time Von Einem was living very close to where Mark Langley lived, coincidentally. I can just see where we can find Von Eymann's address. Sorry. Yeah, so we'll go see where Von Einem lived and show you how close he lived to Mark Langley. So that's back in Campbelltown. So very close. So that was Von Eynem's home at the time of Mark Langley's abduction in 1982. Mark Langley lived right here in Newton, so very close. That was all coincidental, but yeah, Von Einem lived in the northeastern suburbs just like Mark Langley, so he would have been heading in that direction and would have come across Mark Langley. Two things would happen. Either Mark was hitchhiking, looking to get back home to Newton, or he was walking along the road. Von Einem pulled up and said, "Hey mate, do you need a ride?" Mark Langley would have probably said, "Yeah, I live in Newton, can you get me near there?" And Von Einem would have said, "Oh yeah, I live in Campbelltown, that's right near you." I mean, and he'd be telling the truth actually, and he would have said, "Yeah, get in the car." And obviously Mark got into the car. Von Einem would have given him some alcohol. He always carried cans of beer in the car, in an esky in the back seat. Somehow he spiked the drinks, not exactly sure how, if the can's not open. One of his accomplices, Mr. B, would later say that Von Einem would tell boys that he would give them a pill and tell them it was an upper, that it would help them stay alert, when in fact it was a sedative and mixed with alcohol would induce unconsciousness. But whatever happened, Mark Langley was abducted by Von Einem and then murdered. Now we'll go to the location where Mark Langley's body was found, which is in the Adelaide Hills. So Mark's body was found on Monday, March the 8th, 1982, off Sprigg Road at Summertown, in the Adelaide Hills, near Mount Lofty. That's east of the city. So in this general location, so this is Sprigg Road here. I'm not exactly sure where Mark Langley was found. Pinpointed the area, probably in this area here. Von Einem would have dumped his body off it's quite a bit of a steep drop down there, and Mark Langley's body was found not sure how far from the road, but a man was spraying, two men were spraying weeds on that Monday afternoon when they discovered Mark's body. Mark had lain there for quite some time, probably a week. So he was killed relatively quickly after Von Einem abducted him. Certainly no longer than 48 hours. Mark had died from the same blood loss anal injury as the other victims. There was also an incision into his abdomen. But yeah, so that's where Mark Langley was found on March the 8th, 1982. Just pull back and give you a bit of a look, see? So yeah, right there in the Adelaide Hills in Summertown. So that was the murder of Mark Langley. In approximately April 1983, Von Einem and his mother moved from 13 Rowney Avenue, Campbelltown, to a new home at 7 Day Street in Paradise. So we'll go from his Campbelltown home to Paradise home, which is only a short distance. Paradise is a northeastern suburb of Adelaide. So Von Einem and his mum moved into this home, as I said, I think in April 1983. So that's the home there in Day Street. And that was where Von Einem was living when he abducted his fifth and final victim, 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. Richard, of course, was abducted on Sunday evening, June the 5th, 1983. So we'll go to that location now. Richard, of course, was living at 31 Ward Street in North Adelaide. Well, virtually on the doorstep of the city of Adelaide. So that's Richard's home there. So we'll just pull back, show you where he lived in location to the city. So that's Richard's home up here, and the city just south of there. Also not that far, Richard's location, from where Mark Langley was abducted, down here, again coincidentally. So yeah, Richard was living at 31 Ward Street, North Adelaide, in this home here. This is Ward Street here. Now on the night of June the 5th, 1983, that Sunday evening, Richard was at home with one of his mates, Carl Brooks, his best mate, and approximately 6 p.m. it was time for Carl to go home and catch the bus. So he and Richard left the home, 31 Ward Street, and walked along Ward Street here in a westerly direction until they reached O'Connell Street. O'Connell Street here is the sort of the main thoroughfare that connects the city of Adelaide with the northern suburbs. As someone who's always lived in the northern suburbs, every time we came into Adelaide via car, we'd come through O'Connell Street. So the bus stop where Richard was... So they went to a bus stop here on O'Connell Street, which is right in about here. There was a bus stop there, or still is a bus stop. They waited for the bus arrived, Carl Brooks got onto the bus and went off, and Richard then turned and began heading home. He was eager to get home. So which way did Richard come? My initial belief was that he'd come simply back the way he'd walked along O'Connell Street, but in fact it appears that he went into, whoops, didn't want to do that. Let's go back to a wider shot of O'Connell Street. So there's a little side street in here called Marion Street, which connects with O'Connell Street. So Richard walked briskly along Marion Street, which then emerges into Bolton Street, another side street, and leads back into Ward Street. So that's the way it looks like Richard came on that evening, and he began jogging east along Ward Street, until his abduction. It, again, 100% sure where, but this is Margaret Street. The corner of Margaret Street and Ward Street. And this is most likely where Richard was abducted. You can see his home is just over here. So we're only talking about 50 metres or so from his home. But it appears Von Einem, along with unnamed accomplices, corralled Richard into the corner of Margaret Street here and dragged him into the car. You can just see how close it was to home, so that just makes it even more tragic. So Richard Kelvin was abducted. He was held for 5 weeks by Von Einem before he was eventually murdered. Now, Richard's body was found off Airstrip Road in Sampson Flat in the Adelaide Hills, northeast of the city. So this is Airstrip Road here. Now, the exact location where Richard was found, again, not 100% sure, but it would have been able to ascertain it was perhaps in this location here. Now, Richard's body was found on Sunday afternoon, July the 24th, 1983. He was found by a man named Trevor Holmes, who was out collecting rocks on the airstrip. It's an old airstrip, had been disused by then. Richard had lain in the bush for about 2 weeks. In fact, it was 2 weeks before he was discovered, which means he was, as I said, kept for 5 weeks. He died from the same anal injury as the other boys, blood loss from the anal injury. He'd also sustained a deep bruise to his back, indicating he'd been struck and beaten at the time of his abduction. Yeah, so that's where that's where Richard's body was found on Sunday, July 24th, 1983, in the Adelaide Hills. Richard Kelvin would be Von Einem's last victim, and the drugs that were found in Richard's body to use to sedate him, along with alcohol, would lead police directly to Bevan Spencer Von Einem, and Von Einem would be arrested for Richard's murder. We'll go back to Von Einem's home in Day Street Paradise. He didn't get long to enjoy his new dwelling, as on November the 3rd, 1983, detectives Trevor Kipling and Bob O'Brien attended Von Einem's house in Day Street Paradise. He was arrested and he was charged with Richard Kelvin's murder, for which he was subsequently convicted and would spend the rest of his life, the next 42 years, in prison, where he would die on December the 6th, 2025, in the prison hospital at Yatala Prison. So they were the Google Earth locations of Bevan Spencer Von Einem and his murder victims. And thus, that is the end of Bevan Spencer Von Einem.